our great monument to George Washington doesn't even involve a statue. I mean, it's this obelisk in the middle of Washington, D.C. It's 200 feet tall, but it's inhuman. And that's what we've allowed him to become in our culture. And I think that's a sad thing.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name's Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor. And today we have part 2 of my chat about George Washington with David Stewart, the historian. And with all the horrors of Ukraine at the moment, I hope you can join me in looking back to a time where there were leaders who did not take advantage of their countries. And in George Washington, that was certainly one. And we talk about him as the man, and we talk about his relationship with John Adams and the influence of Hamilton and Jefferson on Washington's administration. And we talk about him and how he separated his military and political roles. In doing so, set a precedent that stands today. So I do hope you enjoy that. Elsewhere on our website, we've got a great piece coming up for International Women's Day, all about this quite amusing woman called Mary Frith, who sounds like an absolute character of the Stuart period. In 1611, she was arrested for unwomanly acts, which involved drinking, smoking, swearing, and wearing men's clothes. So that's an amusing piece in time for International Women's Day, which is on Tuesday, the 8th of March, and features Holly Kite, is the author of that. Elsewhere, as I have mentioned before, and I'm going to keep on doing it, we do have our unpublished novel competition. Details on the homepage. Have a look. If you know anyone who's written a historical novel, get them to apply to win the competition. The prize is £500 and the novel gets published. So with all this ghastliness of Ukraine, we do have a chat next week, which was going to coincide, well, it still is going to coincide with the Ides of March, but I'm going to be speaking to Peter Stothard, the author of The Last Assassin, which deals with the assassination of Julius Caesar, who was a dictator, felt invincible and secure, and was about to embark on an invasion of a foreign land. And so there are some echoes of what's happening at the moment, but I want to speak to him and talk about if there are anything that resonates today with the assassination of Julius Caesar. And he's certainly a man who will know about it. Not only has he written this book, he was editor of The Times for 10 years and worked as a journalist in Downing Street when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. So it's going to be an interesting chat, all sorts of stuff that he will know that will help, I think, in our understanding of events today. So without further ado, though, I will take us back to the War of Independence, George Washington, with me and David Stewart. And as ever, you can get me on the Twitter at OllieWCQ. I hope you enjoy the show. The main thrust of the book is his sort of his political learning. So he cuts his teeth in the Burgesses. As a Burgess in Virginia, which is, I guess, would that have been the equivalent of a state senator nowadays?
Exactly, and it was the highest political office you could be elected to. There was a governor's council, which was operated a bit like a senate, but you had to be appointed to, and he was frankly never rich enough to get that appointment. And he served 16 years in the legislature, and I like to point out that he was a legislator 5 years longer than he was a soldier. So he really was, in important ways, a political animal, and he goes into the Burgesses after his military career really has cratered. And it's a turn. He has decided he's not going to become a military person. That's not going to be his career. The British Army does not want him, not because, near as we can tell, not because of his missteps, because frankly they were British missteps as well, but because he's a Virginian, he's a colonial, he's not worthy to serve the crown in uniform.
That was a general approach, really. It wasn't really targeted at Washington, was it?
Oh,
Any
exactly.
Virginian wouldn't have.
They didn't want any colonists, so he had to do something else, and he decided he would. Uh, he had sort of lucked into Mount Vernon by then. His brother had died, his brother's widow had died, his brother's daughter had died. So he was number four on the list, and he got the property. And he would become a political force. That was his goal. And he arrives at the House of Burgesses in 1759, miserably prepared for it. He is a poor public speaker. As I've said several times, he doesn't feel uh, comfortable with his education. He hates debate. He feels like he's lead-footed and slow, which may well have been true. Um, so he's got to find a different way to succeed. The American environment, which is part of the British tradition, was, a political leader needs to be a great orator and needs to engage in debate in a slashing and powerful style. Well, Washington can't do that. So he's got to figure out other ways to advance. And that's his great challenge after the 7 Years' War.
There's a great story where he's in the Burgesses, where he's trying to get some legislation passed to stop pigs sort of basically crapping everywhere. And he doesn't manage to get it through, does he? He has to rely on a colleague to sort of oil the wheels.
Yeah, it's a slightly mysterious sequence because this is pretty non-controversial legislation that has been adopted in a number of places. And
It seems like a slam dunk, doesn't it?
yeah, and who's against it? The pigs don't actually vote. So, but it fails. And then it comes back very quickly. And clearly, in my mind, Washington has recruited Edmund Pendleton, who was the smartest lawyer in the House of Burgesses at the time, to carry the bill. Pendleton reinvents the bill. He calls it a bill to preserve the water quality. It's an environmental bill now, because of course, when the pigs do what they do, the it, it makes the wells the wells and the drinking water noxious, and it sails through. And Washington doesn't say a word through the second life of this legislation. And my sense is he's just sitting there learning. And he's watching Pendleton and seeing how he deals with his colleagues, how he revives the bill, how he maneuvers to get it through, how he uses a sense of timing to bring it up at the right moment. When he becomes president, one of the stunning things about Washington is his sense of timing. He doesn't bring things to a boil or to a vote until he can win. And I think this is the sort of thing he learned by watching, by experiencing.
And he's not a brash individual at this stage, which, well, whatever really. But he's you see this in the Continental Congress as well, where your descriptions, he's sort of working the room by through social occasions and getting to know the other delegates, and they're getting to know him. But he must have done a brilliant job, because he's appointed the commander in chief, isn't he?
He does, and he uses affability and courtesy and dignity and, to establish a persona. And he's a big guy, and he's always dressed perfectly, and he has charisma. When he walks into the room, everybody notices him. But then he uses that as the platform and builds out from it. Uh, and he does demonstrate, I think one of the most important things he does is he demonstrates that he can get things done. There's lots of smart folks in the world who just aren't terribly good at getting things done. And if you asked Washington to do something, it would be done quickly and tolerably well. And that's a real gift that people appreciated. This is a man who spent a lifetime of 12 and 14-hour days. He worked from sunup until after sundown. And that establishes your credibility, that you can be trusted with responsibility. And that was a key thing for him. And I just want to emphasize with Commander in Chief, there were political forces that helped him in that election. It wasn't just that he was brilliant politically, brilliant personally.
Mm.
The Army, all the fighting had been in Massachusetts. It was around Boston. The Army was all New Englanders. So they wanted somebody from another part of the colonies to be Commander in Chief, just to show that they were united. So he had that virtue of being from Virginia, which was the biggest colony. The other thing is, to be honest, we didn't have a very deep pool of military talent. So the other candidates were, well, to call them unimpressive is flattering. So Washington, even with his quite checkered military career in the French and Indian War, at least had some experience, which was considerably more. Well, the two candidates who did have experience, one was chronically bizarre, and the other was basically English. And you really can't rebel against England with an Englishman at the head of your troops.
Would have been quite nice had
Well, they continued to serve, although the one I described as bizarre may well have turned into a double agent at some point. And that was Charles Lee. But accusing someone other than Washington, I think pretty clearly was going to be a mistake.
As Commander-in-Chief, he dealt with was sort of political machinations to unseat him quite deftly, didn't he?
Yeah, he had a bad stretch of about a year and a half when he didn't win anything, and that's never good for the general politically. And then there's this smashing victory up at the Battle of Saratoga, where the American troops are led by Horatio Gates, who was an experienced British soldier who had moved to the colonies. And so there was a move to supplant Washington with Gates. And it was done subtly. Gates had an ally who was a smart guy. He's disappeared in history mostly because he lost this particular struggle. But he arranged sort of bureaucratically to set up an organ superior to Washington, and then to get Gates as president of that. They called it the Board of War. And Washington could have taken them on directly. And I think the young Washington would have, been thundering diatribes against them and really created quite a ruckus. But Washington keeps his powder dry. And he basically says, I don't take these guys seriously. They're going to mess this up. And ultimately they do. They sort of overreach themselves. Washington makes some key alliances with people in the Congress. And we had no actual government at this time. We had a Congress, which was essentially a debating society and a diplomatic body. But the Army answered to Congress. So Washington always respected them, and he got support from them, which was essential. And the conspirators just just fritter away. It ran its course in about 90 days during a winter, and it was a winter of discontent, a phrase that comes to mind. But again, to me, it's a sign of Washington's maturity that he plays his cards carefully. He doesn't bluster around. He knows that he's got strengths, and he's got to essentially let these people blow themselves out.
And I guess the strengths that he learned in the French and Indian War with lightly armed but fast moving troops was going to be much better than the British approach of marching steadily in line. Was going to be successful.
Yeah, although to be honest, the British learned that same lesson. We shouldn't be too arrogant about this. They walked into enough ambushes that they figured out that really wasn't the way to go. And so they had light infantry during the Revolutionary War, and they had German units that also fought the same way. I think the Jaegers, you would describe that way. So, war in America was different. It was not a bunch of open fields that you could have set piece battles in. That occasionally happened, but it was the exception, not the rule.
Now, I was very interested in George Washington's relationship with John Adams, because they seem to have got on quite well early on at the First Continental Congress. But it's not a warm relationship, is it? What was their relationship like?
It's a great question, and I'm not totally comfortable answering it because I'm not positive it is a relationship. They don't exchange direct letters that have survived, particularly other than business letters. And Adams latches onto Washington at the Continental Congress as the best answer to the need for a commander in chief, and he does endorse him and present him. So that's a key step. But it's not because he's crazy about Washington. And, Adams is this short, dumpy guy who's way too smart for his own good. And Washington's this tall, elegant fellow who, Adams thinks is a little dim. So they're not naturally, they don't have a natural affinity for each other. I think it got worse for Adams because when his wife finally meets Washington, Abigail Adams, who was a brilliant letter writer, someone whose her impressions that she left are wonderful. She thinks Washington is the bee's knees, and she just carries on about what an impressive, marvelous man he is, and that had to annoy the heck out of John Adams to have his wife carrying on like that. And then when Washington is elected president, he gives a very diffident endorsement to Adams as a candidate for vice president. In fact, he gives it so late that nobody can actually read it in time for the voting. So, by the end of his presidency, Washington knows Adams will be his successor politically, and he wants Adams to win because Washington does not want Jefferson to win that next election. That's the first real contested election. And so there is a little warmth between them then, but that's about it. And Adams always had a bit of resentment that Washington got all the attention. And he has a famous quote about that the history would only notice Washington and Franklin and wouldn't notice terribly important people like him. And it was a pretty good prediction.
Now, in your introduction, you mention, I think in one of the final sentences, that we shouldn't be asking whether we're Hamiltonian. Well, I say we Americans shouldn't be asking whether they're Hamiltonians or Jeffersonians. They're Washingtonians. But is that more because Washington finessed sort of Hamilton's ideas behind where the government would go, rather than Jefferson's slightly more disparate approach to the United States?
The Hamilton versus Jefferson argument, which is one I've lived with way too long, is continues because you can argue both sides. Hamilton did, in fact, have a tremendous impact on the economy. But then when Jefferson becomes president, as our third president, he does change the political culture in a way and opens it up to more democratic common man forces. And they both leave a big imprint. But they are the contestants, and I end up falling back on this sometimes. They both worked for Washington,
Mm.
and he was the guy whose vision of America as a continental nation, as a nation of significance, as a nation of stability, and we're not doing so well on that last part in the last couple of years, um, is the vision that actually I think has prevailed for most of our history. And what we expect from a president is what George Washington modeled. Not Alexander Hamilton, not hustling off to the dueling ground, not Thomas Jefferson, sitting alone in the White House and reading Voltaire. We want a guy who's going to be out there and solve problems and act with integrity and dignity. Uh, we don't often get that, but that's the model. That's what we aim for.
And I think his most laudable trait is that he does seem to have been, even though he was full of himself, he was modest enough to know when it was time to finish. He didn't outstay his welcome. But even when he was appointed commander in chief, his words are very sort of, I might not win, I might be a bit unlucky. He always seems to have this kind of I guess diffident approach to these huge jobs that he's got.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's important to him to set expectations low. I was struck reading the records of the House of Burgesses, which I think pretty much nobody does. It's pretty obscure, but every time a new royal governor arrived from Britain, he would make a speech to the House of Burgesses and would say basically, I am not equal to the task I've been given. I trust you will overlook my errors because they will be errors of the head and not of the heart. I'm condensing considerably, which is exactly what Washington says every time he gets a big job. And it struck me that I think that was sort of an 18th century convention, and it was one he imbibed from those royal governors. And it's kind of refreshing to hear it. And I think he meant much of it. He was an endlessly ambitious fellow. He was capable of looking around the room and saying, well, why not me? I'm as good as they are. But I don't think he felt like he was better than the others. And I think he understood that, arrogance, a showy personality was not comfortable for him, but also was not going to work for him. So, he was a low-key individual in public. I mean, he had a poor voice and was very careful in what he said. You will find no stirring speeches by Washington. He simply was careful.
Leaving the presidency before and that's a precedent that's set by him. Without him, we could have had presidents lasting a lot longer than 8 years, couldn't we?
Absolutely. His two great retirements, first from the Army at the end of the war and then from the presidency, uh, were terribly important precedents for us. The first established that, military leaders would not just transition into civilian responsibility. That has happened occasionally with generals running for office, but they have to get out of the Army and stand for election. And the second was that, presidents need to go away and not hang on and die in office. And those were heartfelt in his case. I think both times he really wanted to go. I mean, he just, was tired of the jobs and was worn out, and he liked Mount Vernon and he wanted to go home. But they also reflected his understanding that if he was indispensable, and the term we use for him sometimes, that wasn't good for the country. That there had to be more than just one guy. And he acted on that. I think we were extraordinarily lucky as a nation to have this founding figure who understood that and acted on it, and set the precedents that they have stood the test of time.
We're coming to the end of our chat, and I've really enjoyed talking to you about George Washington. He's definitely viewed hugely positively, ironically, in this country, despite the fact that he's responsible for booting the British out. And because I keep on saying "we" throughout this conversation, as if he's in any way, been like a British leader, but he does feel like he's got a kind of something that anyone in any other country would respect and would be happy to have him as a prime minister or president. Unusually so, actually, when one thinks of political leaders.
Yeah, he had a gravitas and accessibility. It's something I think we lose in this country, is his ability to connect with people and at an emotional level, which was key to his leadership. And it's encouraging to think that in Britain there's a more positive view of him. In this country, he's become a bit of a remote figure. Part of that is time, but part of it is the persona he had. But his face has been such a totem in this country, and it's on the dollar bill. It's ubiquitous, and it always looks like his teeth hurt, which in fact they did. And that's not the fellow who led the country, and that's not the fellow who set so many of our important precedents.
And do you think more recently, I know we've covered slavery, so we don't have to go into it, but do you think that's another reason why maybe he's not given as much nowadays of respect as he should have?
There is a reflexive reaction to any of these slave-owning leaders about that. But no, I think we lost Washington well before that.
Right.
He just became this marble figure. I mean, our great monument to George Washington doesn't even involve a statue. I mean, it's this obelisk in the middle of Washington, D.C. It's 200 feet tall, but it's inhuman. And that's what we've allowed him to become in our culture. And I think that's a sad thing, and one in my small way I'm trying to counteract.
Well, I think you have. He does come across. You certainly get his humanity coming across, very much so. And now you've written about James Madison, Aaron Burr. You've written about the impeachments of presidents, which I mean, all these things I could talk to you for hours about. But are you planning on another nonfiction? I know you're writing novels, and we're gonna looking. I think you've got a novel coming out in November. And one's just come out. But are you planning another nonfiction book?
I am. It is not ready for prime time, so I can't describe it. But I am looking for a change. I feel like I've worked through this era pretty hard, and I'd like to take on something else.
Oh, I was wondering if you were going to do something like John Adams, because I don't.
Yeah,
Fascinating character.
they are, but to work a couple of years or more, the Washington book took 5 years.
Yeah.
You got to really want to do it, and I can, I can tell I don't.
Okay, well, fair enough. Uh, David, thank you so much for coming on. It's been really interesting. I'll put links in the show notes for the book. It's coming out in paperback. It's just coming. In fact, what I haven't mentioned is that 2 days ago was George Washington's birthday.
He's 290.
Yeah, which was celebrated, wasn't it, early on but not anymore, sadly.
Well, you folks are to blame for that. It was the tradition to celebrate the king's birthday, so Washington was the closest thing we had. So they made his birthday a national holiday, and it was right up through my childhood.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and it was a day off, and so was Lincoln's birthday. Uh, and they fell very 10 days apart in February. So in good years, he got 2 days off. Um, then we fell prey to this hideous modern obsession with 3-day weekends. And so now we have President's Day, which is always on a Monday, so we can have a 3-day weekend in February. And I refuse to celebrate Franklin Pierce or James Buchanan or Richard Nixon as presidents. So I view it as Washington's birthday.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure we'd love to get you back on again to talk about some of the, especially impeachments. I find that fascinating.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I really did enjoy talking all about George Washington with David Stewart. And I think I probably went a little bit overboard at the end. But I was in the middle of reading coming to the end of reading his brilliant book, which I do recommend. And it was just opening my eyes to a man who I had, as we talked about right at the end there, is difficult to connect with as a human being. But I think David's book certainly manages to do that. And that's even taking into account what we discussed in part one. So next week, as I mentioned, we've got Peter Stothard on the assassination of Julius Caesar during the Ides of March. And what I would love if you could give us a good review, if you could follow, subscribe, share with your friends and family. It's great doing these. You get an hour to talk with a fantastic historian. I get to read a book all about what they've been writing about, and it allows for an interesting chat. So if you've got any suggestions, you can get hold of me. I'm at OllieWCQ on the Twitter. But I will leave you. Thank you and good night.